Welcome back to the next installment. In the previous episodes you would have noticed that we've had a compression tests and we've sent parts away for engineering and rework. We've received those parts back. Cylinder 4 was rebored to 0.5 oversize along with the rest of the cylinders, so we've managed to save the block and the cylinders, which is great. It saved us a bucket load of cash, which we can save and put back in our pockets. It was a massive relief that the guys managed to save the cylinder 4. So it was quite surprising that even with the state of the piston, it was in really poor state, that it didn't damage the bore significantly. So we were very, very lucky there, I would like to say. So the cylinder head itself has got brand new intake and exhaust valves. We've got new valve stem seals, we've got valve seats. The whole head has been redone brand new. It's been skimmed and it's ready to go. So today is more focusing on prepping the block and the cylinder head ready for a nice fresh lick of paint. We want to make sure once we assemble the engine, she's looking good, she's looking fresh, ready to go back in the old girl, because we are absolutely twitching and can't wait to get back on the road with the old girl. It's been a long time coming, but this is unfortunately one of those things that we've had to do, so I'm glad we're doing it. Even though it sucks sometimes, but it's a great process to be in, to learn about engines, the assemblies, all the engineering tolerances, what you need to look out for, and listen to all the sounds and looking at all the components and how everything goes together. It's a really, really rewarding process. So, and then being able to disassemble and assemble it both in and out of your engine bay is a great skill to have. It is a really, really great skill to have, and it prepares you for loads of eventualities that you may find yourself out on the tracks or out on the road or somewhere. So very happy with that. So more important today is prepping the block and the head along with all the surfaces areas here. So once we've grinded all these areas down with the wire brush, we're going to clean all the block and the head, and then we'll clean all the surfaces up, and then we'll start laying out all the brand new parts ready for assembly. So got a little bit of work to do today, so let's get stuck in, and I'll see you in later in the episode. Now that the block is clean and tidy, we've both cleaned internally and externally. We've cleaned the lower block section exactly the same. Now we're going to move on to assembling the lower block section. Now the first things we were looking at is the oil squirters. Now these bolt into your lower bore section. They comprise of two components. You've got the oil squirter and you actually got a hydraulic bolt. Two little components here. So the oil squirter itself has got a little lug, and that locates into the block, and that will make sure that you install that correctly and it directs the oil correctly onto the back of the piston. So that lubricates and cools the piston as it cycles through the bore. Now more importantly, this hydraulic bolt has a spring-loaded ball bearing internally, and what I noticed with a few of my ball bearings is they were locked open. So what I suspect over time is materials such as from the big end bearings and various other components have made their way into these components and wedged them open. So I don't think that's done very well for the oil pressure throughout the system, and I think what's happening is that more oil is being delivered to certain pistons more than others, and it's not probably the most ideal scenario. So you want to ensure that each of these are operating correctly. So we're using assembly lube, we've used compressed air, we've blasted out the galleries, we've freed up every single ball bearing. They all work pretty well now, all back to factory standard, which is good. So key point there is to look out for these little buggers. They regulate the amount of oil that goes into the back of the pistons, and I think that's quite an important little component there, especially working with the piston and coming from the damage that we've just had on cylinder 4. So these could have attributed to the damages that we had in cylinder 4. So top tip for you guys, keep a lookout for that, and as we go through the assembly process, we'll discuss and show you guys what we found and things to look out for.
So, as you can see, there's quite a lot of progress that's happened. You're like, hang on a minute, did I just miss editing? No. So what's happened is I've basically steamrolled ahead along with Alfie. We've done a real solid and we've assembled quite a lot of the engine. So the last time you saw me, I was talking down the lower end of the engine. From there, I moved on quite quickly to the rest of the components, got all the pistons prepared. So one thing to look out for when you're assembling your own engine is ensure that your pistons are facing the correct orientation along with the conrods. So take that into account. The conrods and the lower clips, if you want to call them that, or the clamps, they are part of the same conrod. So just ensure that though you have those two mating parts that need to go back together. Luckily with these motors, there is a serial number that goes along the bottom, and they tend to cut off or orientate a letter or a number in a way that when you put them back it fits like a puzzle, which is a nice indication. So you can't really go wrong on mating those two lower points. So another thing that I'll highly recommend during any engine assembly is get yourself assembly lube. It is very, very important. You can use a engine oil as long as if you're in a team of guys and you know you're going to be assembling the engine in obviously a few hours, then you can get away with it. But if you're going to be assembling the engine and then going away for a few hours or maybe a day or two and then coming back, you want to do that with assembly lube. With normal oil, as you can imagine, it will eventually, gravity will take effect and it will run out of all the areas that you've lubricated. So assembly lube is more like a syrup. It's pretty thick and it stays with those components until it heats up, and then it moves off those components when you need them to. Highly recommend that. So that's what we've done. Obviously there's been a difference when I was assembling the lower end to now. It's been quite a few days, so all the assembly lube is still in the places we need it to be. A lot of the components have been sent away for sandblasting, and I have applied a VHT graphite grey to some of those components, dressed them up. They look a lot fresher, look nice, along with a block that's been VHT black with a clear coat VHT lacquer over the top of that. So it's given a nice sort of glossy look, and it helps with any dirt and grime not sticking to the engine. That should theoretically just fall away, especially with that clear coat. It protects that lower paint, and that goes basically from bottom all the way through to the top. We've VHT'd everything as much as we could. So we're going to move on to a couple of the other components, just graphite grade those, and then the components we've obviously assembled is the heat exchanger. We've got the timing gears in the front. I didn't really do the covers of those. I didn't have the tools to disassemble some of the components. I just left them as it is and clean them. And to be perfectly honest, that's a hidden part of the engine. You won't really see it, so it's not really a problem. Now you're probably thinking, look at this concoction of chaos here. Now I've got an engine hoist, engine stand, and a chair. The 1HDT motor is a 6-cylinder, as you can see, straight 6. So it's a very long motor. So you can get to a certain point by assembling the engine, but when you start adding weight to it, what happens is the motor or the engine stand will start tipping its nose, and that's exactly what's happened. So luckily we caught the engine, we put the seat under there straight away, and then we're like, okay, we've really got to support this engine. So we got to a point where we didn't need to spin the motor around anymore. So everything down below, we've got the oil pickups in, all the conrods have been torqued down to spec. Everything down the lower end is basically built. So we just needed to keep it in this orientation now to bolt everything on the sides, and then we're going to straight into the engine bay. So that is the plan for tonight. We're going to try and put pedal to the metal, get as much assembled as we can, get it into the engine bay as it is right here. We want to keep this in this orientation, put it in. That will help us, especially with these two upper bolts for the bell housing. They are absolutely notorious to what a pain in the ass to get them loose. So you need like 1-meter long extensions on your ratchets, and they're still a nightmare to get undone. So we're going to leave it like this. You have better access. We'll get those bolts seated in, and then we're going to get the cylinder head onto the block, and then we can motor forward from there by getting all the plumbing in, all the electrics, get the injectors in, turbo, and the exhaust manifolds, all those kind of items, and then we start slowly getting the batteries and all those kind of things in, and we will be knocking on the door of starting this engine probably tomorrow. So I will be honest, I am pretty nervous, but I have followed the manual to the very last letter. So like a Bible, I have followed it. I've checked everything. I've checked gaskets. I've gone through everything with a fine-tooth comb, ensured everything was torqued down to spec, orientations, ring spacing, ring orientation, you name it, we've basically done it. So we should be good. I'm confident we will be okay, but you still have that nervous feeling, that especially when you do something yourself, especially like this, and something that you truly enjoy, that it is nerve-wracking. So I think tomorrow is going to be a nervous day, but also a very exciting nervous day. So I look forward to it. So right now, let's get stuck straight back into this. We're going to get as much done as we can, and then hopefully you guys enjoy the time lapses. If you guys have suggestions, comments, or whatever you want to chuck at us, let us know, and then we will see you later in the video.
The heart is back in the beast. A huge milestone for AJ and I. We burnt the midnight oil last night. We were here gone past midnight. A huge monumental effort from both of us to get this motor in. It is a big motor, it's long, it's heavy, and it does take a bit of wrestling to get it in position. The most important thing that I mentioned before was leaving the cylinder head off. That really helped us in the situation. It helped us get the two bulkhead bolts in onto the bell housing. Once we got those seated, that really kept everything in position, and then we could align the motor where we needed it. So, and that's where we kind of called it a day. It was high fives all round, and we got some good rest last night. So what we're going to focus on today is getting the engine mounts aligned and installed, and then everything is just backwards from there. We can get everything else mounted, all the turbos, the manifolds, all that stuff around the side of the engine before we start working on the top. So we want to get as much of the stuff done as we can. We'll need to get, once it's all mounted and seated correctly, we'll get that the diesel pump installed. That's a very important component to get installed correctly, because what we'll need to do is time that with the engine. As most of you guys know, these mechanical engines and mechanical pumps need to be timed with the cylinder, so we'll ensure that is done correctly before we start putting all the fuel lines in, and everything becomes very restrictive and stuff. So we're going to get focused on that. So very happy to see the engine in the engine bay. It was a very good moment last night, so very happy. So we're going to crack on, and hopefully by the end of the video we can see some more progress. Right, for those of you who obviously watch the channel, know that the channel is all about honesty, integrity and facts, and we don't kind of hide anything and glamorize anything. So and you're probably wondering, hang on a second, you're supposed to be starting your engine, you're supposed to be driving, we're supposed to be all smiles and all that kind of thing. No, that is not the case. That is definitely not the case right now. So what's happening in a nutshell? We went to start the engine. It's Wednesday now. We tried to start the engine on Monday. So everything was going exceptionally well. We checked all the tolerances as we were obviously building the motor. Everything was good. Assembled the motor, chucked the motor in, filled the fluids, connected everything up. Everything was good, tightened everything down, make sure everything was torqued correctly. every single thing that needed to be done was done. We followed the manual to the letter, and when we went to start up, everything, like I said, everything was a-okay, going really smoothly. We primed the fueling, so I consumed quite a bit of diesel trying to get the fuel primed into the pump. We eventually primed the system, and we turned the motor over. She eventually started to splutter into life, and we're trying to draw that fuel through into the fueling system, into the injectors, and she was kind of kicking over a couple of cylinders, and within a few seconds she stopped, came to a stop. Now, thankfully, I've replayed the scene in my head about 1,000 times, and questioning everything. Did I check everything? And I can assure you, I checked everything meticulously. However, it was obviously not to be. So what happens with a engine rebuild? Once that if especially with new bearings, new components, the tolerances are a lot different in terms of their tolerances are a lot tighter, a lot smaller, a lot finer. So things won't go as smoothly as you'd think. So every tolerance was checked throughout the whole rebuild process. Every bearing was checked, every piston ring gap was checked, every single thing was checked and lubricated with assembly lube. Everything was done very meticulously, but when it came to startup, it was not to be. So the engine bound up, and then I stopped immediately, and I can assure you it is probably the most gut-wrenching and heartbreaking thing you could go through, especially when investing so much time and so much effort into a project, and then it literally comes to a grinding halt in front of your eyes within a matter of seconds. It's very, very heartbreaking. So what I've started doing over the past couple of days, I've kind of stepped back, thought about the situation, gathered my thoughts, gathered my composure, and thought about things and why would things go wrong. And this is with new components. You've got to be very, very careful with new tolerances and things being a lot tighter. Even though the motor spun around beautifully and it was like butter, when we turned the crank manually before the engine got started, everything was operating wonderfully. We filled up with oil, we cycled the oil through the motor, got everything lubricated, everything was going okay. And it's just one of those things, if a bearing isn't happy, it's going to let you know pretty damn quickly, and that's what's happened. So I suspect it's one of the main bearings that has grabbed the crank, and it's bit down and it's held onto that crank. So it's a good thing I stopped cranking the motor, otherwise we could do some serious damage to the crank. And the other good thing is we don't have to strip the entire motor if it is one of the main bearings. So we can get the motor out, we can spin her upside down, we can check from the sump, have a look from below and see if there's any damages. I doubt there's any scoring or any damages to the physical bores, and then it will give us an indication as we start going through the different bearing caps. When we start loosening each of those bolts, it'll give us an opportunity to see which bearing cap may be biting down onto the crank. So if it's just one bearing, then great, we can basically take that lower block off, we can massage the bearing, get into a better state, double check those clearances and see what's going on. We might have to just check the crank as well, so we'll double check the crank, make sure that's okay, and then put it back together, and then hopefully go for round number 2. So that is kind of the situation. So what I'm going to do is disconnect the motor from the bell housing, disconnect the rest of the components on the side of the motor, such as just the fuel lines, the electrical components, just get it and leave it as a complete motor, and we'll extract the motor and then spin her upside down on the shop floor. So that is what we're going to do right now. So as much as I would have loved to have started that motor and we'd be like literally reversing out and going for our first joyride, it's not to be. So we kind of like backtracked quite a few steps. So sucks, really sucks, but here we are. I wanted to show you guys and take you guys along with the ride, and that's exactly what we're doing. And then for those of you who are building motors, these are the things I would like you guys to look out for. Is problems like this. So yeah, bear with me while I rip up the motor. Okay, our suspicions were true. We found the problem. We originally thought it was a tolerance problem. That isn't the case. So how did we find the problem? So we obviously had to extract the motor out of the engine bay, and we dropped the sump, and then basically we went down on the lower block section. We loosened each main bearing one at a time, try to spin the crank, tighten it back down, and we basically moved systematically through the crank that way. And we eventually found it. It was the third main bearing, or number 3, or whichever way you want to look at it. So number 3, it was tight, it was bound up. So we knew exactly where the root cause was, which is good. So that narrows it down to one component and one issue. So it also gave us an opportunity to have a look up into the bores and the rest of the stuff in the engine, and there were minor scratches in the bores. So immediately when I saw that, I knew straight away that it wasn't a tolerance issue, it was a contamination issue. So very, very frustrating. So I mean, we meticulously went through every component, we wiped everything down, put everything in the engine, everything was lubed up beyond anything we could chuck at the engine in terms of assembly lube. So that was very, very frustrating to find the type of damage we found. So the only thing I can think of is there must have been some either metal filings or something trapped somewhere within the oil galleries around the engine somewhere. Bearing in mind we did blow out all the oil galleries, everything with a air compressor. So that still doesn't say that everything is out. So, and this is obviously one of those. So what happened is, once the oil obviously is in the engine, you've got obviously the oil pickup. The oil picks up that oil and distributes the oil around the engine, and makes its way down through the galleries into the crank, and then the crank distributes it into these main bearings. Okay, and these main bearings have a hole in the backs of them, and then they have an internal gallery where that oil sits and lubricates the components in the crankshafts, and all those mating surfaces. It keeps them all lubricated. Now, the only way something could have got into this main bearing is through that little gallery there. So that's clearly what's happened, and the extent of this damage on this bearing is incredible. So something really hard, like a metal chip of some form, has made its way into the main bearing, and I'll give you guys a close-up of what I'm talking about here. So it's really, really incredible what's happened here. So as you can imagine, you've got a very tight tolerance with the main bearing around the crank. You have that oil, a very light oil film, and that keeps everything nice and lubricated and stops it from moving. So once that damage started occurring on the main bearing, basically a groove has been cut out right next to the gallery. So something really hard has basically got into there and ground down all the bearing material on both sides. So literally a perfect circular circumference of damage. And as the groove is being ground out of the bearing, as you can imagine, it's raised the sides of that groove, and then and that side obviously the tolerance becomes a lot less and less and less, and eventually that binds up, and that's exactly what's happened. It's heat, and then obviously that tolerance, and then it's just grabbed onto the crank, and it's amazing. Something as simple as that little component there stopped an entire engine. So literally stopped it in its tracks. So very, very interesting and incredible to see. So what we found is not only that this damage, this is obviously the worst, which is good. So it's limited to this area here, but there must have been some more metal flakes working its way around the engine, because we found small scratches on the rest of the main bearing. So it tells me that the crank was contaminated, full of metal filings of some sort. So it was completely contaminated, because a lot of the main bearings are scratched. There's a few little embedded objects in some of the bearings, so I'll try and give you a couple of shots of that, but luckily very, very light scratches in the bores, so that can be manually honed out, so that's okay. and there was a couple of small scratches on the sides of the piston skirts, so we've repaired those. We've basically wet and dried those down, get rid of any burrs around any of the oil rings and the piston rings, got rid of all that. Make sure that the bore is beautifully and smooth. So yeah, so the unfortunate thing is I don't have another set of main bearings at hand, so I've had to order a set. So I came across a set, and excuse my ignorance, these are just general normal main bearings, but I came across a set of ACL race bearings for the 1HDT. So I purchased a set of those, and in the meantime we've washed the engine down several times, all components, and I mean with hot water, very liquid, to get rid of all the oil. Washed it down, washed all the galleries out, both oil and water, and then used the air compressor to blast out all the oil galleries, and all the components. So prior to assembly, for round number 2, we'll be blasting it out, each gallery out again, to ensure that there is no further contamination in any of the areas. So I do not want to be going through this again. This is a very, very valuable lesson to those of you out there who would like to build your own engine or rebuild your engine. Ensure that all your components are free from any contamination, debris, especially in my case, when I stripped my engine, there was a lot of metal filings in the bottom of my sump. So I think the whole engine was contaminated, full of stuff. So it's down to you, just obviously clean it. So yeah, ensure that hot soapy water, especially like a fairy liquid which breaks down oil, degrease everything. Literally try and, what you'll find with these little metal filings, they embed themselves in little nooks and crannies everywhere. So you really want to get that heat and that water in the galleries, loosen up all that grime and that old oil, and then blast everything out with a air compressor. So as you can see there, I can hear the rain is coming down as per usual. But yeah, that's as far as we are at right now. We've got to wait for the ACL bearings to arrive, and once that's arrived, we'll be going through the rebuild again, or the assembly. To be fair, I enjoyed the assembly process. It's a nice process. I enjoy that kind of thing. So we'll be doing that and then chucking it straight back in the old girl. So we know it's actually a very simple process. Once you've done it once, for the second time, and then go for the second, it's relatively okay. It's not too bad. The only daunting thing is to ensure that things like this don't happen to your engine, and it's hard to predict or hard to monitor until you turn that key, and then you're pretty much set. So yeah, wish me luck, guys. So hopefully in the next episode we will show you the assembly process, but this is more of an update, show you what's happened, kind of be honest with you guys and not kind of sugarcoat anything, and watch out for main bearings and big end bearings like this that can be subject to particles and debris. And we'll see you in the next one.
I have exorcised the demons. This house is clear.